So it's great to see you all here. You know, we've dedicated over the last 8 months or so several programs to understanding critical minerals, which was something we really weren't talking about a couple of years ago. In September, the Center for European Studies hosted a screening of the film Lithium Rising. And then in October, we had our first Carolina Diplomacy Fellow alumna return. Emma Sampson came back from Johns Hopkins University to talk through why critical minerals matter, and she did a special look at also lithium. And then in November, we had a senior official from Indonesia, Septian Hadioseto, and he talked about Indonesia's approach to refining nickel before shipping it out as a pathway to development, which is stalled out in Indonesia, and they need a new pathway. And tonight, Ramon Escobar joins us to discuss why Latin America matters to this conversation. So how do modern industries like AI, energy, and tech rely on global supply chains? And why does he believe that Latin America is essential to these industries? So I'm going to do something I never do, which is I'm going to do a couple of slides. So why have we made critical minerals such a focus of diplomacy initiative programming? One reason is that they're essential to meeting what we now understand to be a soaring demand for energy, especially electricity. With rapid growth in technologies like, finish the sentence, AI, and other energy-intensive innovations, global consumption is rising fast, making a deep understanding of energy systems critical to understanding how our world is interconnected and to our global future. Take a look at this chart from the World Resources Institute. Its title is U.S. Electricity Demand is Expected to Skyrocket After Years of Flat Demand. Now, this one only starts in 2016 before you see the jump, but it's actually been flat since almost the turn of the millennium. And the trend is not confined to the United States. This graph, which we pulled from Fareed Zakaria's Sunday GPS show on CNN, shows electricity demand is expected to rise across France, Germany, the UK, as well as the US. The source from that, the base source, is Bloomberg. Global electricity consumption is climbing in step with the adoption of new technologies such as electric vehicles, which are a trade-off, and AI, which is just a brand new demand on energy. So as our world just continues to change rapidly, we in Global Affairs, we remain committed to highlighting emerging global trends and offering timely, insightful programming that engages directly with these great challenges of our time. So with that broader energy landscape in mind, it's the perfect moment to turn to tonight's central topic, to understand how critical minerals and global supply chains fit into this story and why Latin America plays such a critical role. We're so fortunate to have here with us someone who spent much of his career navigating these complexities. It's really my pleasure to introduce Ramon Escobar. After almost 2 decades in the U.S. Foreign Service, Ramon now serves as the managing director at ACTUM, a global consulting firm, where he leads the geopolitical practice and advises clients on navigating markets affected by industrial and national security policies. He also serves as a senior advisor at the Milken Institute Finance, contributing to policy dialogues for the Geo-economic Initiative focused on Latin America. You can find some of his writings there. Most recently, when he was in the Foreign Service, Ramon served as Director of Western Hemisphere Strategy at the National Security Council, leading President Biden's efforts to advance U.S. economic priorities in Latin America and the Caribbean. Ramon also, as I mentioned, he served many years in the State Department. We first met in 2010 when Ramon and I served together in the front office of the U.S. Embassy in London, running the largest U.S. embassy in Europe. We were just sharing stories of that with Jen in the green room. Throughout the years since, Ramon and I have continued to find ways to work together, and tonight is another wonderful opportunity for us to do that. I'm so excited you're all here for this, so join me in welcoming Ramon Escobar to the podium.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear? Does that work? Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And thanks, Barbara, for inviting me to North Carolina to participate in this. You guys are extremely lucky. You got one of the best. Barbara's been a mentor of mine for many years, somebody who I've looked up to, and honestly, you guys are you couldn't have asked for a better person to lead the diplomacy initiative here. So we're going to jump into this presentation. You guys have my bio and all that. Okay, so why Latin America matters, critical minerals. So I'm going to start by talking about Latin America, and I'm going to make two basic arguments. First is the relevance of Latin America. When we think about if you take a step back and put on a sort of U.S. foreign policy, a national security hat, like you think you're responsible for the interests of the United States long-term, our competitiveness in the world, U.S. global economic leadership. When you think about the challenges that face us from achieving those policy objectives, you can't really get too far without adding Latin America into your equation. It has 8% of the world's population, but has 20% of the oil reserves, 20% of the hydro. It's a powerhouse when it comes to both renewable and conventional energy generation. I'm going to get to critical minerals in a second. Even on the food security front, it's a net exporter. It's one of the bread baskets of the world, and its yields are relatively low. There's a room for improvement with technology and applications. The human talent, the United States is growing older. This year, I think we're going to have the first zero growth rate because of some of the immigration policies that are in place today. So we're going to start getting older faster. Latin America produces more engineers than we do. They have a twice as large working age population than we do. And they have a real proclivity for tech, for innovation in a way that normally you don't really see in emerging markets. And I'm going to talk about that in some greater depth later. And then, of course, there's the critical minerals piece. So whether your policy objective is the energy transition and trying to advance the energy transition as quickly as possible, or your objective is to win the global AI race, or your objective is to be for the United States to be the EV hub of the world, in any of those scenarios, you need to have the critical minerals that are sort of the underpinning of any one of these new industries, innovative industries. And going back to what Barbara said on regarding the energy consumption, the average AI, the average hyperscaler in the United States requires 27 tons of copper per 1 megawatt of compute. 1 megawatt. They're building 800 megawatt, terawatt facilities around the world. That is so much copper because of the energy intensity of those machines. And you guessed Latin America is the largest producer of copper and some of the largest reserves of copper in the world, not to mention the other minerals. But no matter what industry you're focused on, what industry you think should be the priority for the United States, the digitalization of the global economy will require critical minerals as a core fundamental part of it, and will require access to power, access to energy. And it most likely will be for the foreseeable future an all of the above approach and solution. Latin America has all of these pieces. All these pieces, and it's in our own hemisphere, and it's in a region that has the geographic advantage. So the main sort of mantra that I have, and what I had in the White House and what I continue to have in the private sector, is if the United States is going to be competitive, particularly with our primary economic rival, which is China, in any one of these sectors, we have to build a competitive industrial base. We have to build a competitive economy. We can't do it alone, despite what some members of the Trump administration might think, that autarky is a real potential path forward. It's hard to see that play out. And where I think the Trump administration has gotten it right is to recognize the strategic relevance of Latin America as part of the solution. So here we have all the materials that you need, the inputs, the talent, people, the energy to build a competitive industrial base. The second part of why Latin America should be important is we're pushing on an open door. Latin America is not the Latin America of the 1950s. This is not a Fidel Castro versus the American Empire. It's not a Yankees go home Latin America. And I know this firsthand. When I was in the National Security Council, I spent a lot of time with almost every leader in the Western Hemisphere, with very few exceptions. From the left, from the right, it didn't matter. Socialist, self-proclaimed socialist presidents, presidents that would critique and criticize the United States publicly and refer back to the American imperialist days and all those things when it was politically convenient. But when the doors were closed and the cameras were off, and you were sitting there in front of representatives from the White House and the head of state of that government, the ask was very clear. The ask was, we need the U.S. investment, we need U.S. technology, we need U.S. business people to show up. You've been missing in action. We have one option, and that option is China, and that's not good for us. We're pushing out an open door. It's not simply the shifting political sands in Latin America, which, by the way, in the last, say, 12 months, have shifted much more in the pro sort of aligned with the United States camp across the region. And really remarkable. But it also shows up in the data. So there's a lot of talk about the United States playing second fiddle to China on the trade relationships in Latin America. And that's largely true in South America. But when you look at the region as an aggregate, it's actually not so, it's not that compelling of an argument. We have more than 2x the trade flows with Latin America than China does with Latin America. And even when you strip out Mexico, which is the biggest part of that, we're still basically on par with China in terms of trade. And I'll tell you a quick narrative around the trade piece that is really interesting. The United States, the number one trading partner with for Costa Rica, for example, is the United States. The number one trading partner for Chile is China. The number one export of Chile is, I believe it's copper. It might be lithium, but I think it's copper, but it's a commodity. Number one export of Costa Rica, can anybody guess this? There's some of you were in class earlier today that you can't guess. Not coffee, it's not bananas, it's not, what were some of the other, tourism, none of those things. It's medical equipment. These are supply chains. These are countries that are moving up the value chain and are part of an integrated supply chain. The trade relationship between the United States and Brazil, although commodities are in the mix, also includes airplanes, cars, includes electronic equipment. It's value add, it's real supply chains. Brazil's exports are soybeans, beef, oil, commodities. The neo-colonial relationship for Latin America today is China, and that's just a fact. And so when you go and knock on the door of a socialist president in Latin America, who shall remain nameless, it's no wonder that they're looking for the United States to show up again. And then you have the cultural pull. Like, let's not even, we're not even getting into the fact that since the 1950s sort of left versus right Latin America context, how many Latinos have immigrated to the United States? How many familial relationships are there? I think the United States is like the third largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. It's the ties, the narrative of the Yankee and the American imperialists grow weak when you have a cousin living in the United States who's raised a family and is having success and living the American dream to some extent or another. And then you get into other factors like remittances and all these. So the point of that latter part is we remain the socioeconomic center of gravity of Latin America. The same cannot be said for Southeast Asia. It cannot be said for Central Asia. It can't be said for Sub-Saharan Africa. It can't be said for Eastern Europe. But in Latin America, we are. So how has China made so much progress in Latin America despite all of these natural sort of linkages? If you think about China's foreign policy strategy in Latin America, I think, like I use the example of the spear. So the tip of the spear for China has always been affirmative. It's investment, it's trade, it's economics. It's how do we solve some of your funding problems in critical infrastructure. You need to develop your cash cows, your critical minerals, your soy, your ag. How do we play part of that? It's only after the spear gets in there, nice and snug, you start to see the geopolitical realities start to surface, the policy objectives that are behind that economic agenda. This is when you start to see, the dual-use ports. This is when you start to see Huawei technology becoming the de facto standard, and the risks that are associated with transferring your data across unsecure systems, telecom systems. This is what you see with difficulty in securing critical mineral offtake, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And it's been successful. As I've alluded to in the conversations that we've had with heads of state in the region, the impression in Latin America is the United States is out to lunch, and that the Chinese have taken over America's traditional role in the region. And I think you have to give kudos, right, to this approach. It's very compelling. I think it was, I can't remember if it was Larry Summers who it was a quote, the Chinese show up with an airport, and we show up with a lecture, right? And it really did feel that way sometimes. I felt like I was in the National Security Council, I felt like building the strategy of how do you mobilize private capital to align with our national security priorities in Latin America. You were fighting with one arm behind our back. You had very few tools, often ineffective, often too slow to actually come down and play offense, as I call it. And in Latin America, and with China, they were playing with both hands. They had both hands free, maybe even a third. So how do we do this? How do we compete? The table setting is very appealing in Latin America, as we talked about. We're pushing on an open door. And I think that we have begun to recognize as a government, and I think this is bipartisan, and I'll explain why. I think that we have begun to see how the United States is learning how to use the tools that we have at our disposal, and Congress, through bipartisan manner, is giving us more flexibility to deploy these tools. There's a couple of terms that are agencies that I just want to put out there and explain very briefly before I go into an example of how we're actually playing offense, as I call it. The DFC, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. This is one that you guys should write down. Anybody who cares about foreign policy, who cares about geopolitics, who's interested in this one, if you don't know what the DFC is, get smart on it. Their capability it's a financial institution. It's basically a financial arm of the United States government that can invest abroad. And it can invest in a way that advances our national security and supports development, economic development downrange. They just went from a $60 billion cap of investment cap to $200 billion just last month. Congress approved it bipartisan. They essentially quintupled their equity capability, so they can now do equity investing, which is significant. They've lifted the income limits. So now countries like Panama, which were off limits for DFC for some bizarre reason, and we couldn't invest, for example, in ports along the Panama Canal with our Development Finance Corporation. And lo and behold, who picks up? We couldn't invest in Chile, where there happens to be a ton of lithium and copper and all the byproducts that come with that. We couldn't invest in there with DFC. That has been fixed, and they did it in a bipartisan manner. So now you have a tool that has more capabilities, more capacity and more capabilities to align with our interests. The other one is the Export-Import Bank. This bank has historically been criticized as like the Bank of Boeing, right? Where you just finance exports of U.S. products from companies that otherwise probably could get financing elsewhere. And But now this in a bipartisan manner, like for example, the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, which is a new initiative under ACTUM where they can support mining projects, for example, with financing, as long as that offtake comes to the United States. And this gives us a new flexible tool that we can deploy. That came under Biden and is now being deployed heavily under the Trump administration. And then the latest vehicle, and then I'll stop with my glossary here, is the Office of Strategic Capital, OSC, which is a new financing tool that's controlled by the Department of War, Department of Defense, which can provide debt and grants in support of supply chain resilience, for example, as long as it's linked back to our defense needs, our defense industry. All three of these agencies have real policy tools that we can deploy. We can be competitive. And I'll give you an example, a real life example of how one came to be in the critical mineral space. So, critical minerals. The challenge that people often talk about, it's not just the source of the critical minerals, the raw material, it's the processing, the ability to process the material into usable goods, right? Materials. And earlier today I was in a class and somebody asked the right question. Well, isn't the processing piece actually the real choke point? And should we even worry about the materials? And the answer is yes, we have to worry about the materials because you can't even begin to process if you don't have the feedstock. And if all the feedstock is locked up in long-term offtake agreements, which the Chinese are very good at doing, you can't even begin to build a processing facility here or hope to. And so one of the first problems that we were trying to solve in the National Security Council is how do we solve that first order problem that can then complement and support a broader strategy? And DFC does equity. Equity is powerful because it's risk capital, so you can use it in a riskier situation where debt otherwise would not be compelled to go. But it also can be levered. Be leveraged up. So you can take that equity and bring in a lot more investment, crowd in private capital. What we did with Orion Resource Partners, which is a private equity fund, the U.S. private equity fund that does exclusively mining. It's the largest one in the world. The DFC partnered up with Orion to put $600 million in equity of U.S. equity through DFC into a vehicle that was then capitalized with $600 million from Orion and $600 million from ADQ, which is the Emirati Sovereign Wealth Fund. So we took $600 million of U.S. government money and turned that into $1.8 billion. And I reckon by the end of this year, that'll probably be closer to $5 billion. They're still raising money, and I think they're going to raise a lot more. Now, this vehicle, what it can do is go invest in mines around the world, not just in Latin America, but they will do a lot in Latin America. Invest in mines and secure the offtake from that mine, that future production. And now if you want to build, say the US government wants to ensure that there's copper smelting capability in the US, we have a tool that can go and secure the future offtake so that we can justify building that processing capacity at home. Something that OSC can jump into, ACTUM can jump into, and you can start pulling together the different policy tools to start building that supply chain. This is a real life thing. It took probably a little too long for it to come to fruition, but it actually happened and it's operating and it's now deploying. It's a great signal for the United States to send to our partners around the world. It's gotten attention, that's for sure, from other governments. I've heard it myself in my travels throughout Latin America and also in conversations with governments in Africa. It's the first time the U.S. has actually put something on the ground that is aligned with our national security priorities, showing up in a space that traditionally has been dominated by China. And so I think I'll just close out by saying, when you look at Latin America and you see, but first, when you look at the challenge that we have in terms of U.S. global economic leadership, and you recognize that we're not going to solve this alone on our own, especially in a way that's competitive or sustainable. And you look at this region, this hemisphere, where the door is open and it has the complementary assets that we need to be able to build a competitive industrial base. We now have the recipe with the foreign policy tools that we have to actually show up, play offense, put an alternative on the table, and compete and be competitive with China. It's exciting for people like me because we finally took that arm that was tied behind our back and pulled it out and can compete and play ball. So I'm going to leave it there and look forward to our conversation there.
So thank you, Ramon, for kind of laying that out. And you already discussed this in your talk, but I'm going to ask this again just to be sure it has a chance to sink in. So when you were traveling all around Latin America during the Biden administration, I want you to talk about what your experience was like, and I want you to answer a simple question. Did you have a hard time getting meetings?
Yeah. No, it was remarkable. The sentiment in Latin America when we showed up and we had an agenda. The agenda was, the initiative I was leading was called the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. And the whole notion was, this is a region that is not well integrated. The United States has been focused elsewhere. It was distracted by, the global war on terror and all these things. And in the meantime, China kind of filled the void. And so when we first came out and started knocking on the door of the countries that we invited into this partnership, it was, normally for heads of state, they're very protocol conscious of like who they're meeting with. With the U.S. showing up with a positive agenda, talking about finance, not lecturing on, whatever the issue of the day was. It was, I think I heard it from several leaders, music to my ears. Like, where have you been? Fine, you're back. It was invigorating. And like I mentioned, it didn't matter if it was political left or political right. The bear hug that we received was real and genuine. But I would also add, though, the expectation is that we deliver.
Yeah. And, too cumbersome, right?
Yeah, and we have to show up with something that's, that's why we ended on this platform, is like you have to show up with something that will have an outcome. Like at the end of the day, like for better or worse, our hemisphere is so democratic. It was like 95%, and now, well, I'm going to say 95% of the population in our hemisphere lives under a democracy, right? We're extremely democratic. What does that mean? That means that these leaders have to be responsive to their people. And what does that mean? They need economic opportunity. They need jobs. They need to be able to create a livelihood. And if the United States is not coming with solutions that help these governments deliver on that promise, I think the welcome mat will go away.
So we're going to have to deliver, and I love the idea of showing up with something. And in your paper that you wrote advocating for the DFC to be renewed with the restrictions removed, you talked about really tapping into America's strategic advantages here, which are really deep capital markets and a robust private sector, and bringing them into the solution set. You want to talk about that for just a minute?
Yeah. So when I showed up at the it was funny because when I showed up at the National Security Council, one of the friend of mine who brought me in, he's like, I don't know if this is exactly the quote, but he's like, you're the one foreign policy guy that can read a P&L, like a profit and loss statement, right? Like, you understand business. I have my own little side business I started in the private sector. But you get the foreign policy piece too, right? You know that part. So we want you to kind of run this play. But my thesis going in, and what I really focused on, was we had two comparative advantages in the United States over China in this competition. One is deep private capital markets. We will never compete. Congress is never going to appropriate enough money to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, and nor should it. But if Wall Street were to show up and allocate 4 or 5% more of its capital in line with our national security priorities and Latin America or any other, pick a region, we could wipe the floor with the Belt and Road Initiative. It wouldn't even be a competition. The problem is that Wall Street on its own, or private capital on its own, is not thinking strategically. So even though US FDI into Latin America is 2x that of China historically, all of China's FDI is strategic. Not a dollar goes into Latin America that isn't strategic, whereas US is. The second piece, and we could talk, I'd love to talk a little bit about this too at some point, is the innovation piece. The US remains, the AI was born and started here in the United States and, Silicon Valley, but really all across this country. And those two things, that's what everybody in Latin America wants. They want American investment and they want American technology. They want to be a part of that solution.
I'm going to go to that one because I think it'll be really good. Although we got to tell the story about the Latin America guy in the White House because I think that'll be very
yeah.
end on this one. So, when we were preparing for this, you told me, this is why I know this fact, is that despite Latin America having a smaller population than Southeast Asia, it actually has more unicorns. And I want you to talk about that. What are those unicorns and how did this happen?
Yeah, no, it's really awesome. So the developing countries of Southeast Asia has not just more people, but also more VC, more venture capital. So they have more risk capital and more people, yet Latin America's outperformed. And I found it fascinating. In fact, when I was in the White House, I organized probably first ever, maybe last, unfortunately, meeting of venture capital funds, founders, investors, with the National Security Advisor of the United States of America in the White House, talking about the importance of supporting innovation and entrepreneurship in the region. We mobilized $1 billion to go into venture capital investing in Latin America. It was awesome. My favorite thing that I did. And that effort is, in my mind, is relevant for a national security advisor because it's one of our advantages. So you have, Latin America is very technology forward, like they lean into tech inherently. I think Brazil is like the third highest adoption rate of ChatGPT in the world. All these unicorns, all that. And there's two reasons for it. One, it goes back to this connectivity with the US, right? Part of the PayPal mafia that came out of that were Latinos, and they were studying in Silicon Valley and then went back into Latin America, and Adolfo Babbitt's started Clip, and one of the first unicorn. And you have all these different things. The other thing is Latin America has deep structural problems in terms of its economy. You have near monopolistic type businesses that operate, deliver very poor services with little competition, big moats. You have problems in finance on the unbanked and underbanked is massive there. Healthcare problems, access to healthcare, quality of healthcare is very low. Education, you name it. These are all solutions that technology can solve for, and that's what the unicorns that you're seeing, Nubank, Bitso, Clip, you name it. These different companies are they're solving for problems that traditional businesses have been unable to solve for, and it's exciting that, and that's exactly what innovation and entrepreneurship is best at doing. Is what is a problem that like one of my clients is a VC fund that invests both in the U.S. and Latin. And his first question always is, what problem are you solving? If you can't answer that question, then you're not going any further along the pitch, right? You got, what problem are you solving? Guess what? In Latin America, there's a lot of problems to solve. Supply chains, mobility, logistics, inefficiencies. It costs more to go from Bogota to the Buenaventura, transfer a container than it does to get to Singapore from Buenaventura, right? Like these are real logistical problems that need to be solved for. And technology will play a role in all of these. And so I think that to me is a really interesting thing that binds the U.S. and Latin America, because every one of those founders, every one of those tech unicorn founders, their North Star is the United States. This is the place where they're going to Silicon Valley to raise capital. They're going there to learn, to join startups, to become familiar, and then take that experience and knowledge back and solve problems that no American startup is going to solve, but a Colombian startup might. right? Or a Brazilian startup. Yeah.
That is very cool. There's a book called The New Argonauts, which is about kind of coming to the States, getting your education, figuring out how these capital markets work, and then going back out into the world. And Latin America does not figure in that book, but there's a chapter that clearly could be written about that. That is great.
Not the story of it, though. Latin America is always kind of just forgotten, right?
Now, the last time I heard you talk was in November when I scheduled you. So I just want you to know we didn't do Latin America just because of recent events. We were on this ahead of the time. But the panel that Ramon was on at the World Affairs Councils of America's annual conference in Washington was named Forgotten Places, and he was on the other forgotten places in the world. So I think it's something of an understatement to say Latin America doesn't feel like a forgotten place today. But I wanted you to just tell the story. You were the LATAM guy in the Biden White House. Tell me the story about that.
I'm joking. This is something that my boss would say. He's like, you could walk into the White House. So we were in the E of the Eisenhower building. You could walk across West Exec into the West Wing, light yourself on fire, and everybody would, don't worry about it. It's just a LATAM guy. We're good. But it's remarkable, right? I mean, there's lots of things to critiques you can make, and we can kind of talk about that. But I welcome the pivot to the Western Hemisphere. I welcome the acknowledgement that we cannot win any of these competitions if we don't partner up with somebody, and the most obvious partner, in my opinion, is Latin America. And what I will say, though, is that going back to what I mentioned before, we have to come with an affirmative agenda. We have to play offense. We can't just play defense. We can't just look at this as like, it's our way or the highway. It has to be, let's build this highway together. It's a partnership.
It does feel like great power competition might actually encourage us to up our game and show up in Latin America, not with a lecture, which is such a great way really to describe our policy for a very long time, but offering something positive. The mics are open. We're going to turn to student questions. If you've got one, just go ahead and come out to the aisle. I'm going to ask one more while you think about it and come. But what always happens is people sit here, and then as we run out of time, 40 people are lined up, which is not to worry. Ramon's going to stay. There you go. I've gotten you up. This is very good. Ramon, I want to think about this a little bit more. What was really new about your work in the Biden White House, and I remember they had academics come in and join this briefing on this economic partnership. For the longest time, our national security interests in Latin America, they were about the war on drugs, they were about the war on terror, but we actually did not think the economic part really belonged in a proper national security conversation. And I remember when I was ambassador to Panama, we would host congressional delegations, and they would come down and watch Chinese construction, the port on the Atlantic side, the port on the Pacific side, the LNG terminal going in. And they would ask us diplomats, and we would say, these were our official talking points. And I'm talking 2008, 9, 10, so not a million years ago. Oh, don't worry, that's just commercial. That doesn't have anything to do with our national security. And it really was our official policy for quite a while. And it's now it's a recognition with DFC and the funding that, it does have national security implications. I don't agree, we already talked about this with your slide, to say it turned into control. I don't think it ever did, but it turned into very real influence. And we just really were incapable of seeing that until really late in the game and realizing we needed to be there and to be able to offer something. I'm going to turn first to a question from a student. Start over here, and then we'll come over here.
Thank you for the talk, sir. With the current administration making so many waves, is there still hope for these relationships to flourish?
I think so. I mean, I think I was just down in Argentina and Bolivia right before Christmas, and the enthusiasm for deepening partnerships with America and the clear towards us, despite all the stuff that was going on, the tariffs and all this other stuff, was very clear and very evident. I think that the fact that the Trump administration pushed really hard and the fact that there was bipartisan support in the Congress to reauthorize DFC and give it all these policy tools, the fact that ACTUM is led by John Jovanovich, who's a guy who's made it very clear that we're playing offense and we're going to bring financial tools to bear. The fact that when you take all that into consideration and you have the examples of, the Orion deal starting to come to fruition, I have enough data points to give me some degree of confidence that we will get this right and we'll show up to play. Where I'm cautious is how quickly will it happen? And I don't think that the clock is, there's a shot clock and it's running down right now, and we got to make moves. And even the most loyal ally of ours in Latin America will not wait around forever if we can't help deliver results for them, their government, and their people.
Thank you.
Cool. Do we have a quick? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the talk, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Earlier in your talk, you talked about how China has done a lot of investment into sub-Saharan Africa. It seems like sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America are sort of similar in that they have infrastructure problems, and they used to be both very resource-rich.
Yeah.
Are there any lessons you think we can learn from the way we may have dropped the ball in sub-Saharan Africa that we can apply with this new theater that we need to start investing in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to this notion of influence, right? Like while I don't think that sub-Saharan Africa is that every country in sub-Saharan Africa is completely lost, and we have made some moves in the Democratic Republic of Congo recently that shows that we can step up and still do things. I think Kenya, we have a special relationship with Kenya. There's examples. We just have more runway in Latin America because of all the reasons that I explained, but the outcome will be very similar if we don't step up and play. I think that it's the same story everywhere. That's why these tools. That's why I emphasize the importance of these foreign policy tools. You have to show up with investment. You have to show up with private capital. You have to mobilize that private capital. One of the real important things that these tools do, when we talk about how do you take private capital and aim it towards advancing our national security priorities, we have to do the things that make that private capital comfortable doing that, right? How do we de-risk an investment? Places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Central Asia, places that have a lot of political risk, a lot of geopolitical risk. If you're an investor and you're looking at where to put your capital, it's a lot easier to understand the risk profile of putting your money in the United States or putting your money in the UK than it is to go to some far-flung part of the world where the only headline that the media ever picks up on is something negative. Latin America is the headline risk for sure. Drug cartels, boats blown up, Maduro being, taken, abducted, like all these things. These are things that make it harder for private capital to invest. So it was the same experience in Africa. Very little U.S. private capital, very little U.S. business would come to participate. The same thing is happening in Latin America, probably to a lesser degree. The same thing is happening. We have to make it more. We have to help that capital get there, and make that feel comfortable with deploying.
Yes, are you lined up to ask a question? Please, you go ahead, then I'll come to you because you were newer comer to them.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for speaking to us today. My name's Daniela. I'm Venezuelan, and so what's been happening there has brought a big mix of feelings. But I'm wondering specifically when you talk about investment into these countries, Venezuela's oil, Trump has promised a lot of investment in the oil industry there, but I think what I'm seeing is still a lot of hesitancy from companies to start investing there. So I'm wondering where you think that's going and what is the strategic value of investing in Venezuela when it's so uncertain what's going to happen there, and how does it help the U.S. to invest in Venezuela?
Yeah. Look, Venezuela is a big gamble, right? I think that in terms of oil, so the first point on oil, I think it's going to play out the way that most of the industry is looking at it. You're going to have smaller players, like junior players that have a higher risk tolerance or have pre-existing relationships in Venezuela. They'll show up first. They'll make that risk capital. It's not going to be the Exxon. We heard that right out of the press conference that the president had, where Exxon's like, it's not investable today. So I think that aside from Chevron, which is already there and has reasons to continue investing, you're going to have a lot of kind of junior, more riskier, sort of the VCs of the oil game will come in to Venezuela, make those initial investments, get the ramp up production, get the product. And if things work out, meaning there's political stability, there's a transition, there's some better clarity and certainty, and I don't know how many years that'll be, but it'll be years, not months. Then they'll sell those assets off to the big guys. And it'll be essentially be the same play that happened in the Permian with fracking, except in Venezuela, you have the juniors play first, and then the majors come in afterward. As far as investing in Venezuela writ large, I think other areas you'll probably see much more activity, infrastructure in particular, places where the development banks, the regional development banks would be able to support because they can really de-risk and bring capital to areas that otherwise wouldn't. And that'll create some opportunities for investment. One of the big question marks I have, and I don't know, you probably have a better sense, is there's a lot of Venezuelan private capital in the United States, particularly in South Florida. Is that capital going to get deployed? Will Venezuelans invest in their own country? I think that'll be a big first signal. When I've worked with venture capital funds that have tried to fundraise for Latin America, oftentimes the signal that the capital wants to see, the U.S. capital, is there local capital investing along? If there is, then we'll jump in because at least we know that there's somebody on the ground who's sort of validated it. That'll be an interesting thing to see how it plays out as well.
Thank you. Danielle, I want to mention that we're going to do a deep dive into Venezuela and oil and its impact on kind of the whole geopolitics of oil on February 5. This is a late addition to the diplomatic discussion lineup. So be sure to come for that and to have a discussion about it. Although the question about, I think Ramon's answer, it's going to be the wildcatters and the miners, the juniors that come in first is still there because our speaker does assume that people will come in, and you're right about that. It's oil is cheap right now, and it costs an awful lot to get Venezuelan oil out, so that also is making it harder. We'll do a deep dive in that on February 5. So come back for that. We haven't talked about oil in the diplomatic discussion series the whole time I've been here since we started it, because I was really under the assumption, as was the International Energy Agency in Paris, part of the OECD, that we kind of reached peak oil. And what we were going to do was go through a difficult, complex transition to renewables, but we would be seeing, some of these oil reserves would never be pumped. This is part of those slides I showed you. You see how much demand for energy is soaring all of a sudden? That is not so clear now. So that's part of what we're really looking at is this great big question about the energy transition. It may be called, the transition itself might also have a bit of a question mark attached to it. Venezuela is a hugely important player in this, so we'll do a great discussion.
Not to overestimate what's possible with Venezuelan oil.
That's right.
It's more expensive than like the Arabian Gulf, for example, but it is relatively cheap compared to Permian gas or Canadian tar sands, for example. And Canadian tar sands is really the oil that's competing with Venezuelan oil. It's heavy for refinery space. But the other thing is how long it'll take to ramp up production. Even if you have big investments coming in, all that, it looks like it's going to be a pretty gradual ramp up phase. And right now there's more oil than there's a supply glut. So you have estimated about 2 million more barrels per day than is actually needed. So it's an interesting point, but it'll have a huge implication on Latin America, even politically, I think, for a lot of the country.
Hi everyone, I'm Marco. Thank you for your amazing points. I have a question more about El Salvador, or where my father's from. and more how you think if there's going to be more of a wave of leaders like Bukele that are like leaning towards U.S. investment. Because I saw in El Salvador firsthand how now there's a bunch of more money coming in, as you said, and a lot more U.S. investment, since it seems a little more U.S. friendly. Do you think that's going to expand throughout the rest of Latin America?
So I would qualify something. So I think that last I've heard, and I haven't dove into El Salvador recently, but as I understand it, there's been some economic struggle in El Salvador, and there hasn't been a huge influx of private capital into El Salvador. Where I do think that Bukele is probably hitting something affirmative, like something that's attractive to a lot of people, is addressing the security issue. Like Latin America, and it's hard to not empathize. I'm a father, I have 2 kids. Like, I worry about the safety of my kids in a way that, maybe I was in my early 20s, I didn't really think too much about. Just be street smart, kind of know your understandings of anything dumb, and you're fine. You have little kids, you don't think about it that way. You've seen it, you've already seen it across the hemisphere. You've seen it with CAST in Chile, you've seen it with Noboa in Ecuador. The security is a real challenge, and any leader that is seen has a credible plan to addressing security challenges, I think is going to have a lot of success in Latin America going forward. And, I'd say when we were in the peace negotiations with the FARC, former President Uribe was very unhelpful. It was very critical of the peace process. He did everything he could to oppose it and all that. And as frustrating as that was for somebody who really wanted to support the peace process and see it successfully implemented, I think he was the right president for the time when he was the actual president, not the former president, but as a president. You needed somebody who was tough on the FARC. You needed somebody who was willing to take the fight to him. You needed somebody who was willing to push the envelope, because that was what this democratic country desired. That's what its citizens wanted. In retrospect, it seems pretty clear to me. And I think El Salvador is another example of that. This is 1990s Colombia, where people were fed up with the crime and the violence. In El Salvador, I think you saw the same thing. Bukele saw that. Not an endorsement of some of the things that he's done and the lack of rule of law and all those things. And actually, I think part of the challenge for El Salvador to attract more private capital, despite the improved security situation, is there's questions around the rule of law. And, if you're an investor, you need to know that there's rule of law. There's certainty around your investment that will be protected. And it's not just who you know that will determine whether your investment is protected and honored. El Salvador is it's a very interesting country, because in a lot of ways that leader has set off a trend among the Latin American political elite to take security into consideration. I'm not sure it's solved the how do we attract foreign investment question.
In Uribe, you had a president who accepted the Supreme Court's ruling that he was not eligible to run again, which was really quite a moment. Can I get all of you to join me in a round of applause for Ramon Escobar?